My family told everyone I abandoned Grandma. Her diary told the truth. The first time I heard the word abandoned used about me, I was standing in a funeral home parking lot in the middle of July, holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and I thought I had misheard my own aunt. She just couldn't be bothered. My Aunt Carol was saying to a woman I didn't recognize, her voice pitched just low enough to sound private and just loud enough to carry. Barely visited at the end. It's a shame, really. Eleanor deserved better. I stood there with the cup sweating in my hand and I didn't say anything, because in that moment I genuinely believed it was a misunderstanding. Grief does strange things to memory, I told myself. People say things they don't mean when they're hurting. I walked past both of them into the funeral home, signed the guest book with a hand that wasn't quite steady, and sat in the second row because the first was reserved for my mother, my father, and my brother Connor, who had flown in 2 days earlier from Denver looking exhausted in the specific way people look when they want you to notice how exhausted they are. My name is Renee. I was 34 years old when my grandmother, Eleanor Whitcomb, died in her sleep on a Tuesday in June, in the house she had lived in for 41 years, in the bed she had shared with my grandfather until he passed 9 years earlier. I found her. That detail matters, and I promise you it will matter more before this story is over. I found her because I was the one who let myself in every single morning with the key she gave me 3 years before, the key nobody else in my family knew existed, because nobody else in my family had asked for one. I need you to understand something about my family before I go any further, because otherwise none of what happened will make sense. We were not close in the way that families in movies are close, where there's shouting and slamming doors and dramatic exits. We were close in the way that a house looks fine from the street but has water damage rotting through the walls you can't see. My mother, Diane, was Eleanor's only daughter, and she had spent my entire childhood performing devotion to her mother in public and resentment in private. My father mostly stayed out of it. And my brother Connor had been, since the day he was born, the son that the rest of us apparently orbited, including in her own quiet way my grandmother, who loved him uncomplicated and easy, the way you love someone who has never once asked anything hard of you. I was the one who called Grandma Eleanor every Sunday at 4 in the afternoon for 11 years straight. I was the one who drove the 40 minutes to her house 3, sometimes 4 times a week after my grandfather died and she started needing help with things she never would have admitted she needed help with: the pill organizer, the grocery list, the letters from the insurance company that used language designed to be misunderstood. I was the one who sat with her on the porch in September light and listened to the same 3 stories about my grandfather's Navy days that I had heard maybe 200 times, because every single time she told them, her face did something soft and young that I never wanted to interrupt. None of that mattered apparently at the funeral. What mattered was that in the final 6 weeks of her life, I had missed 4 visits. 4. Because my husband Daniel had been in a car accident, not catastrophic, but bad enough that he'd needed surgery on his shoulder, and I had spent those 6 weeks driving him to appointments, managing his medication, sleeping 4 hours a night in a chair beside his hospital bed and then his recovery bed. I had told my mother this. I had told her twice. And somehow, in the 6 weeks between my grandmother's death and the funeral, that inconvenient fact had been quietly erased, and in its place had grown a story that fit my family so much better, the story where the difficult granddaughter, the one who asked too many questions, who never quite fit the shape they wanted her to fit, had finally shown her true colors and abandoned a dying old woman. I didn't fight it. Not then. I want to be honest with you about that because I'm not going to pretend I was some kind of composed, dignified figure standing quietly above the fray while everyone else threw mud. I went home after the funeral and I cried until my face hurt, sitting on my bathroom floor with the water running so Daniel wouldn't hear, because some old stubborn part of me still believed that if I just stayed calm, if I just didn't give them a scene to point to, eventually the truth would surface on its own the way truth is supposed to. I did not yet know that the truth was sitting in a shoebox at the back of my grandmother's closet, wrapped in a pillowcase, waiting for someone to be patient enough to find it. The will reading happened 11 days after the funeral, in a conference room that smelled like carpet cleaner, at the office of a lawyer named Harold Pruitt, who had handled my grandparents' affairs since before I was born. I remember the particular quality of light in that room. Flat, fluorescent, unkind to everyone's face. And I remember my mother sitting very straight in her chair with her hands folded, the posture of a woman who has already decided how a story is going to end and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. The will was simple on its surface. The house went to my mother. A modest investment account was split 3 ways between my mother, my uncle Philip, who lived in Arizona and had visited Eleanor exactly twice in the last 5 years, and Connor, who received specifically my grandfather's coin collection and a sum of money earmarked, the document said, for whatever venture he sees fit, which was exactly the kind of blank check my grandmother had been writing him his entire life. My name did not appear anywhere in the document. I remember Harold Pruitt reading that final page and then looking up briefly, in a way that felt less like an accident and more like he was checking to see how I was taking it. I remember my mother's exhale, quiet, controlled, satisfied, the sound of a woman confirming something she already believed. Later, in the parking lot, she put a hand on my arm, and for one absurd second I thought she was going to apologize for something, anything. Instead she said, "I think we both know why it worked out this way, sweetheart. You weren't around at the end. Your grandmother noticed things like that." I want you to sit with how strange that sentence is. Your grandmother noticed things like that. As if my grandmother, a woman who wrote thank you notes for thank you notes, who kept every birthday card I had ever given her in a hat box in her closet, who once called me at 11 at night just to tell me she'd seen a cardinal on the fence and thought of me, as if that woman had, in her final weeks, quietly recalculated her love for me based on a spreadsheet of visits and found me wanting. I didn't believe it. Not really. But belief and certainty are different animals, and grief had made me too tired to tell them apart. It was Daniel who suggested, about 3 weeks after the will reading, that we should go collect the things Eleanor had specifically told me, more than once, were mine. A cedar jewelry box, a set of her mother's china, a photo album she'd started making for me the year I got married. My mother had already begun the process of clearing out the house to sell it, and I dreaded the particular grief of standing in rooms that no longer had her in them. But I went on a Thursday afternoon when I knew my mother would be at work, using the spare key I still had, feeling like a trespasser in a house I had let myself into 1,000 times. The house had that specific stillness that empty houses get, dust starting to settle in places that used to be touched every day. Half the closets had already been gone through. Boxes labeled in my mother's handwriting sat stacked in the hallway, marked Donate, Keep, Connor. I noticed, with a small twist in my chest, that there was no box marked with my name. I went to Eleanor's bedroom last because I wasn't ready for it, and when I finally opened the closet door, I found that most of her clothes were gone already, sent off in black garbage bags to a donation center, efficient and fast in the way my mother did everything she wanted to stop thinking about. But on the top shelf, pushed back behind an empty hat box, wrapped in a faded pillowcase with a pattern of small yellow flowers I recognized from childhood sleepovers, was a shoebox. I almost didn't open it there. I almost took it home first, out of some instinct to protect whatever privacy was left to protect. But something made me sit down on the edge of that stripped bed, in that quiet house, and lift the lid. Inside was a spiral notebook, the cheap kind you buy at a drugstore, its cover soft and worn from handling. And beneath it, folded and rubber-banded into small bundles, were papers. Bank statements. Handwritten letters. A few photographs. A yellow legal pad with columns of numbers in my grandmother's careful old-fashioned handwriting, the kind where every capital letter had a small flourish. I opened the notebook first. The first entry was dated almost 4 years earlier, not long after my grandfather's funeral. I want to keep track of things, it began in her handwriting, because I am starting to notice that people remember what they want to remember, and I don't trust my own memory to hold up against that, so I am going to write down what actually happens. I sat on that bed for 2 hours. I did not move. Daniel texted me twice asking if I was okay, and I didn't answer either message, because I genuinely did not know how to explain, in a text, what I was reading. My grandmother had been keeping a diary. Not a diary of feelings, not really, though there was plenty of that too, tucked between the lines, but a diary of facts, dates, amounts, conversations, transcribed as close to word for word as she could manage right after they happened. She had been documenting her own life like a woman building a case, and reading it I understood, slowly and with a rising, sick kind of clarity, exactly what case she had been building. The entries about me were the easiest to read and the hardest to sit with. Renee came by again today, one said, dated a Tuesday in March 2 years before her death. She brought me the blood pressure medication because the pharmacy mixed up my refill again, and she sat with me for an hour even though I could tell she needed to get home. I don't know what I would do without her. I told her that and she just laughed and said, "You'd manage, you're the toughest person I know." But I don't think that's true anymore. I think I need her more than I let on, and I think she knows it, and I think she comes anyway because she loves me and not because she wants anything. I had to put the notebook down after that one. I sat with my hands pressed against my eyes until the shaking stopped. But it was the other entries, the ones about my mother, about Connor, that told the story my family had spent 11 days at a funeral home constructing in reverse. Diane came by today, one read, and she seemed distracted the whole visit, checking her phone. She asked me again about moving some of the investment account into her name, just to make things simpler if anything happens. I told her I would think about it. I don't like how she asks. She doesn't ask like a daughter worried about her mother. She asks like someone doing math. Another 6 months later, I finally let Diane help me set up online banking, since she said it would make paying bills easier for me. She set up an account with her as a joint signer for emergencies. I should have thought about this longer. I don't like that I can't see the account activity without asking her to show me on her phone. And then, dated roughly a year before Eleanor's death, in handwriting that looked shakier than the earlier entries, a single line that made my stomach drop entirely. I looked at the statement Diane left on the counter by accident. There is money missing that I did not take out and did not approve. I am going to start writing everything down, every dollar starting today. The legal pad. The columns of numbers. I understood now what they were. My grandmother, in the last 2 years of her life, had been tracking withdrawals from a joint account she shared with my mother, an account my mother had set up under the guise of convenience, under the guise of care. Dates. Amounts. A column where Eleanor had written her best guess at what the withdrawal might have been for, and beside almost every guess, in smaller handwriting, the word unclear or worse, the word unexplained. The amounts ranged from a few $100s to, on 3 separate occasions, over $4,000. By my rough count, sitting there on that stripped bed doing the math in my head with shaking hands, the total came to somewhere north of $31,000 over 18 months. There were letters too. Not sent, most of them drafts it seemed that Eleanor had written and then apparently decided not to mail, or mailed and kept copies of, I couldn't be sure. One was addressed to Harold Pruitt, dated 4 months before her death, and it began, Harold, I need to make some changes and I would like to do it properly this time without anyone finding out until it's already done, because I am tired of people finding out about my decisions before I've had the chance to make them. I found, near the bottom of the box, a folded receipt from an auto dealership in Connor's name, a loan co-signed, it appeared, by my grandmother 8 months before her death, for a used truck for $11,000. There was no entry about it in the diary that suggested Connor had ever mentioned repaying a cent of it. There was instead an entry dated 3 weeks later. Connor called today asking about his inheritance, whether it would come as a lump sum or spread out, because he's thinking about starting a business with a friend. I told him nothing is decided yet. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't ask about the visit to the doctor last week. I don't think it occurred to him to ask. And then, near the very last pages of the notebook, an entry dated 11 days before she died, the handwriting noticeably weaker, some letters trailing off at odd angles. Renee couldn't come this week, Daniel was in an accident and needs her, and I understand completely. I told her not to worry about me and I meant it. She has given me more than anyone in this family, and I will not let anyone make her feel guilty for taking care of her husband. If something happens to me before I get things properly fixed with Harold, I want it known. I am writing this down so it is known that Renee did not abandon me. Renee is the only one who never once asked me for anything. I am ashamed it took me this long to understand what that meant. I sat in that empty room for a long time after I read that. Long enough that the light through the window shifted and went gold and then gray. Long enough that Daniel eventually called instead of texting, and I answered, and I don't remember exactly what I said to him, only that he was in the car and on his way to me within 20 minutes. Still favoring his healing shoulder as he came through the front door and found me sitting on the bare mattress with a shoebox in my lap and my whole face swollen from crying. I did not, that night, feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that because I think revenge stories sometimes lie about this part. What I felt was something closer to grief compounding on grief, the grief of losing her, and now the grief of understanding fully for the first time what her final years had actually contained. The isolation of a woman who had figured out she was being quietly taken from and had decided, rather than confront it loudly, to simply document it and trust that the truth, once written down carefully enough, would eventually do the work that confrontation couldn't. I did not go to my mother's house the next day and throw the shoebox on her kitchen table. I want to be clear about that too, because it would have felt good in the moment and it would have accomplished almost nothing except giving her the chance to control the narrative again, the way she had controlled it at the funeral, the way she had controlled it for as long as I could remember. My mother was, above almost anything else, extremely good at rewriting a room in real time. I had watched her do it my entire life. I was not going to hand her a live microphone. Instead, I called Harold Pruitt. Before I called Harold, I did one more thing, and I still don't fully know how to explain why. I drove to my grandmother's church, the small brick one she'd attended every Sunday for over 30 years, and I found the pastor, a soft-spoken man named Reverend Aldous who had known her since before I was born. I didn't bring the shoebox. I just asked him carefully whether my grandmother had ever said anything to him, in those last 2 years, about her family, about money, about feeling unheard. He was quiet for a long moment, the way people are quiet when they're deciding how much of someone else's confidence they're allowed to spend even after that person is gone. Finally he said, "She asked me once, maybe a year before she passed, whether I thought it was a sin to keep score. I told her I thought the Lord kept score better than any of us, and that writing something down honestly wasn't the same as holding a grudge." She seemed relieved to hear that. I didn't think much of it at the time. I sat in my car outside that church for 20 minutes afterward, and something in me settled a little, knowing that she hadn't been entirely alone in carrying what she was carrying, even if none of us had understood what it was. Back at the house, before I brought the shoebox to Harold, I made myself go through it a second time slower, because I was afraid I had missed something the first time in the fog of shock. I found, tucked into the back pocket of the notebook, a folded printout of an online banking statement, the kind you'd get if you asked someone to help you log in and print a page because you didn't trust yourself to navigate the website alone. Across the top, in Eleanor's handwriting, she had written the date she'd asked a neighbor, not my mother, to help her print it, and beside 3 separate withdrawals she had drawn small, careful stars, the kind of mark a woman makes when she doesn't want to accuse anyone yet but wants to be able to find something again quickly later. I found a photograph, too, tucked between 2 pages, a picture of my grandfather's watch, the one he'd worn every day of their marriage, with a note clipped to it in her handwriting that said, "Simply for Renee, so she knows I meant it before anyone tells her otherwise," which was, I would later understand, dated only 9 days before she died, and which told me, more clearly than anything else in that box, that she had known, near the very end, that a fight over her memory was coming and had tried, in whatever small ways were left to her, to arm me for it in advance. It was that photograph, more than the ledger, more than the checks, that made my hands finally stop shaking long enough for me to call Harold's office and ask for the first available appointment. I want to tell you about Harold because he matters here more than I expected him to. Harold Pruitt was 71 years old, wore the same 3 gray suits on rotation, and had represented my grandparents since 1987. He had known my mother since she was a teenager. He had, I would learn, also clearly known, or at least strongly suspected, more about the last 2 years of my grandmother's finances than he had ever let on in that conference room, because lawyers, real ones, the careful old-fashioned kind, do not say things they cannot yet prove. I sat across from him in his office, the shoebox on the desk between us, and I watched his face while he read through the notebook page by page, unhurried, his glasses pushed low on his nose. He didn't say much. Occasionally he made a small sound, something between a sigh and a grunt, and once he stopped entirely on the letter addressed to him, the one Eleanor had apparently never sent, and read it twice. "She called me," he finally said, setting the pages down, "about 5 months before she passed. She asked me some questions about updating her will, about something called a no-contest clause, about how to document financial irregularities in a way that would hold up if anyone ever questioned it. I told her I'd need her to come in and we'd do it properly. She said she would. She never came in." He took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I assumed she'd changed her mind. I did not assume this." He asked me carefully whether I had told anyone else about the box. I hadn't. He told me just as carefully that this was the right choice for now, and that there were things that needed to happen in a specific order: a forensic review of the joint account activity, a conversation with the bank, a determination about whether what had happened constituted something the law had a name for, versus simply something that was, in his words, deeply and unforgivably wrong but not necessarily criminal. He was measured in a way that frustrated me at the time and that I understood later, was exactly the kind of caution that kept this from becoming a story where I looked reckless and my mother looked, once again, like the reasonable one managing an unstable relative's outburst. Took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of bank records requested and slowly delivered, of Harold cross-referencing dates against Eleanor's handwritten columns, of me going back to that house twice more, once to search, carefully, respectfully, for anything else that might be tucked away, and finding in a drawer of her writing desk a second, smaller notebook that turned out to be even more specific than the first, with actual photocopies of 2 checks Eleanor had apparently, at some point, had the presence of mind to request from the bank herself, checks written from her account that she had never authorized, made out to my mother's name for amounts that matched, almost to the dollar, 2 unexplained withdrawals from the ledger. During those 6 weeks, my family assumed I had simply accepted the outcome. My mother, when I saw her briefly at a cousin's baby shower, was almost warm to me, the specific, uncomplicated warmth of someone who believes a difficult matter has been fully and finally resolved in her favor. Connor texted me a photo of the truck he'd bought, captioned something about finally being able to expand the business, no acknowledgement of where the down payment had come from, no memory, it seemed, that the debt existed at all outside of whatever number lived in his head marked inheritance. I let them believe what they believed. I am not proud of how much I enjoyed a small, quiet part of that waiting, and I am not going to pretend otherwise, because I think there is something honest in admitting that after months of being cast as the villain of a story I hadn't written, there was a strange, grim comfort in knowing the actual script. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not loud. I want to be honest about that too, because I know what these stories usually promise. A dramatic unveiling, a room gone silent, someone's wine glass shattering on tile. That is not what happened, and I think looking back, the quiet version was so much worse for the people who deserved it and so much better for me. Harold arranged a meeting, framed to my mother as a follow-up regarding some accounting matters related to the estate that needed clarifying before the estate could be formally closed. My mother, Uncle Philip, and Connor were asked to attend. I was there too, which surprised my mother visibly when she walked into the conference room and saw me already seated. I remember the specific flicker across her face. Not alarm yet, just confusion. The look of someone recalculating a scene that had unexpectedly added a character. Harold began, as he always did, without theater. He explained that in reviewing the estate's financial history as part of standard closing procedures, several irregularities had come to light regarding a joint account held by Eleanor Whitcomb and Diane Whitcomb Reyes, my mother's married name. He explained in the calm, procedural voice of a man who has delivered difficult news 1,000 times and long ago learned that calm does more damage than volume ever could, that Eleanor had, in the final 2 years of her life, independently documented a pattern of withdrawals from that account totaling just over $31,000 that she had been unable to account for, alongside a truck loan co-signed on behalf of Connor Whitcomb for $11,000 with no record of repayment. I watched my mother's face while he spoke. I watched it do the thing I had seen it do my whole life, the quick, practiced shift from confusion to composure to a kind of righteous defensiveness, the posture of a woman who has never once in her life believed she could be caught doing something wrong, because she has always been so good at deciding in real time what the story was going to be. That money was for her care, my mother said. For things she needed. I don't have to itemize every single. Harold set 2 photocopied checks on the table gently, the way you'd set down something breakable. These were made out directly to you, Diane. Not to a pharmacy. Not to a home health agency. To you. Your mother requested copies of these from the bank herself, for months before she passed, and kept them in a file along with a ledger she maintained by hand. He paused, and I watched him decide, deliberately, not to fill the silence that followed. She was very thorough. I want to tell you what my mother's face did in that silence, because I think about it more than almost anything else that happened that day. It didn't crumple. It didn't go pale with shame the way you might hope, if you were watching this as a satisfying story instead of living it as an actual family. What it did was go very still, very careful, the look of someone doing rapid math on how much of this could still be managed, still explained, still spun into a version where she remained somehow the wrong party. She was old, my mother finally said, quieter now, and I understood she was no longer performing for the room but genuinely searching. She got confused about money sometimes at the end. You know that. Anyone could tell you that. And this is the part one had been waiting for, The part 1 had rehearsed exactly once in my car the night before and then decided not to rehearse again because I didn't want it to sound rehearsed. She wasn't confused, I said. I have her diary. 2 years of it. She wrote down what happened to her almost every single week, because she said she didn't trust people to remember what actually happened, and she was right not to trust that, because you spent 11 days after her funeral making sure everyone believed I had abandoned her. I kept my voice level. I had promised myself that much at least, that whatever this conversation became, it would not become the shouting match my family always secretly wanted, the one that would let them say afterward that I had been the unstable one, the dramatic one, the one who couldn't handle grief like an adult. She wrote about that too. About me missing 4 visits because Daniel was in the hospital. She wrote that she never wanted anyone to make me feel guilty for that. She used those exact words. I have it in her handwriting. Connor, who had said almost nothing, finally spoke, his voice smaller than I had heard it in years. The truck was a gift. Grandma offered. She co-signed a loan, Harold said, not unkindly, which is a very different thing from a gift, and there's no record anywhere that you've made a single payment, and no record that this was ever discussed as anything other than an advance she expected to be part of the estate accounting, which is precisely why she wrote it down. Nobody said anything for a while after that. I remember the sound of the air conditioning, a small mechanical hum that suddenly felt very loud. I remember my Uncle Philip, who had said nothing this entire time, looking at my mother with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between disbelief and the particular discomfort of a person realizing they'd been standing next to a fire without smelling the smoke. I did not yell at my mother that day. I did not tell her everything I had wanted to tell her for months, the accumulated weight of every Sunday phone call she never asked about, every visit she never made, every story she'd let calcify into truth simply because it was more convenient than the real one. I had thought for a long time that when this moment came, I would need to say all of it, that the confrontation would only feel complete if I emptied myself out in that room. But sitting there, watching her face try and fail to find a version of this she could still control, I understood that I didn't need to say any of it. The diary had already said it. My grandmother, in her careful, patient, methodical handwriting, had already told the truth in a way that no amount of shouting from me could have improved on. All I had to do was let it exist in the room, undeniable in her own words, and step back. What happened after that was not a movie ending. I want to tell you that honestly because I think it matters more than a tidy bow. There was no formal fraud case. Harold explained later that pursuing criminal charges against your own mother is a decision most families, understandably, don't make, and that the estate itself had other, quieter remedies available. What ended up happening was this. The remaining unallocated portion of the investment account, along with a specific adjustment reflecting the documented withdrawals, was redirected, per an amendment Harold was able to draft and have properly executed using Eleanor's own written instructions and witnessed intent, expressed clearly enough in her diary and the unsent letter to constitute, in Harold's professional opinion, sufficiently documented testamentary intent to support a court-supervised correction to the estate. It wasn't a fortune. It came to roughly $42,000, once the accounting settled. But it came to me formally with my name on the paperwork, and more than the money, it came with something Harold said to me privately afterward that I have carried since. Your grandmother built you a case, Renee. Most people just leave a will. She left evidence. Connor never repaid the loan, not in any real sense, though he did eventually send me an email, not a call, an email 3 paragraphs long, that managed to apologize without ever quite using the word abandoned or the word sorry, and I read it twice and decided that it was for him, probably as close as he was capable of coming, and I let it be enough, not because I'd forgiven everything, but because I no longer needed him to understand what he'd done in order to know myself what had actually happened. My mother and I do not speak often now. I want to be honest about that too, because I think there's a version of this story people want where the villain finally sees the light and everyone hugs and Thanksgiving is warm again. That isn't what happened. What happened is quieter and, I think, more honest. My mother called me once about 4 months after that meeting, and the conversation was short and strange, full of long pauses, and near the end of it she said, in a voice I had genuinely never heard from her before, I don't know how to have this conversation, and I said, I know. And that was more or less all either of us could offer the other, and I have decided that's allowed to be the ending for now. Some doors don't close and don't fully open either. They just stay slightly ajar. and you learn to walk past them without needing to know what's on the other side. What I think about most when I let myself think about any of it is not the confrontation in that conference room, and not even the money, though the money mattered more than I expected it to, in the specific way that being formally, legally, undeniably right matters after months of being told you were wrong. What I think about is my grandmother, alone in that house after my grandfather died, sitting at her kitchen table with a cheap spiral notebook, writing down the small, humiliating facts of what was happening to her. Not because she wanted revenge, I don't think, but because she wanted the truth to survive her, in case nobody else was willing to carry it forward. She didn't confront my mother while she was alive. She didn't cause a scene, didn't demand an accounting, didn't do any of the things a person might expect from someone being quietly taken from by her own daughter. She just wrote it down patiently week after week, and trusted that eventually, someone who loved her enough to keep looking would find it and finish what she'd started. I keep that first notebook in the cedar box she left me. The one my mother never bothered to claim from the donation pile because she didn't know what was inside it. Some mornings when the house is quiet and Daniel's already left for work, I take it out and read a page or two, not out of grief anymore, not exactly, but out of something closer to gratitude. I read the entry about the cardinal on the fence. I read the entry about Renee is the only one who never once asked me for anything. And I think about how strange it is that the woman my family spent 11 days painting as someone I had failed had, all along, quietly been the one person keeping score in my favor, waiting, with more patience than I will probably ever manage myself, for the truth to finally get its turn to speak. She never got to see any of it play out. She never got to watch my mother's face go still in that conference room. Never got to see Harold set those 2 checks down on the table like something breakable. Never got to hear me say finally out loud that she hadn't been confused. But I think somehow she knew it would happen eventually because she wrote it down like a woman who trusted the truth to outlive her, and she was right to trust it because in the end it did.